Hello everyone, and welcome to another Storytime with Mr. Jackson. Today I'm proud to bring you the story of Willem Barentsz and his first push for the legendary Northeast Passage. The day had finally come. Countless hours worth of shaking hands and lying to the right people had finally bore fruit. But unfortunately for Admiral Ney and von Linschoten, Barentsz seems to have missed their rendezvous by over a week. I don't know, some nonsense about his ships not being seaworthy and lacking life-saving supplies. You see, Ney and von Linschoten had never been so far as Nova Zembla before, but they all knew full well that every day they wasted at harbor was another day they lost in the field, and nobody particularly wanted to get iced in if it could be helped. And besides, Barentsz and his little light ships were just the northern party, who really cared what they did. That in mind, the two ships spitefully slipped from port and made their own way north. Barentsz and the men from Amsterdam would either catch up or just miss out, simple as that. Lucky for them, though, the North Sea was friendly this year, and Barentsz made excellent time once he actually put out, easily outpacing the first group. And soon enough, both groups found themselves in the Arctic Circle, passing about halfway up the Atlantic coast of Norway, 66 degrees 33 minutes latitude to be exact. And from this point on, the farther they went, the more the nights would shrink into nothing, going from several hours to several minutes to an endless day. After they rounded the tip of Norway, they pressed on into Russian waters, where the Dutch fleet finally regrouped at a large rocky island off the coast that the locals called Kielden. The very same place where on February 11th, 1992, two submarines, one American and another Russian, collided underwater, this causing a major international incident. But I'll save you the details of who was or wasn't following who for another day. Around this time, Kielden was a fairly well-traveled island with a semi-permanent population of maybe a few hundred. More of a dirt village peppered with sod huts than a place of wooden structures and paved roads, but important all the same considering how far north it's at. And to be honest, it was a fairly ordinary place as far as everyone was concerned. Literally nothing to write home about. In fact, Gerrit de Veer wrote in his work, "Upon the 23rd of June they arrived at Kielden in Muscovia, which for that is a place well known and a common voyage. I will make no further description thereof." By northern standards, Kielden was a pretty busy place, her port seeing hundreds of ships pass by at any given year, but when the Dutch compared her simple wooden piers and wretched dirt hovels to the cities back home, she looked more like flyover country, a place for civilized men to avoid. And von Linschoten went much farther, describing the locals as dirty pigs and animals, scarcely human, shamelessly wondering aloud to any who would listen about their bad manners and poor fashion sense. I mean, really, dirty wool and animal skins, how do I season? One day, a local Russian customs officer came alongside and began asking all sorts of irritating questions. The man was a representative of Tsar Fedor I, son of Ivan the Terrible, by the way. Yeah, that one. This Russian official immediately asked for a bribe, but was rebuffed by Admiral Ney, which really seems to have put the man in a bad mood. For suddenly, the official's demeanor changed, and he began reading Ney the Riot Act for allowing his men to fish in the waters around Kielden. And now, suddenly a humanitarian, the Russian went on to inform the Dutch that the people of this island lived off the produce of the seas, and that their boats were small, and thus they couldn't go into the deeper waters. So, by fishing here instead of in the blue water, the Dutch were directly taking food and income away from these people. I mean, really, they were practically penniless. How could these rich Dutchmen take what little they had without any proper compensation? The official then implied that a generous bribe would most likely solve the problem, placing his hand out. Well, Admiral Ney simply scoffed before explaining that the Dutch would be gone soon enough, and that the sea was a big enough place for everyone. Well, as it turned out, the people of Kielden were actually pretty pissed about the Dutchmen fishing in their waters. I mean, from their perspective, all they saw were a bunch of foreigners stealing their livelihood and thumbing their noses at the law. Scandalous. And so, this in mind, they decided to make a plan. And despite there being no night, the townsfolk waited for most of the Dutchmen to turn in. And after they were sure most of them were asleep, townsfolk piled into boats of their own and began stealing the Dutchmen's fishing nets. Well, it didn't take long for sentries on board ship to spot these men, and soon the call went out. Battle stations. More quickly than anyone would have liked, Marines and angry sailors piled into boats and began rowing like the devil after the townsfolk. A short sea chase soon ended with the thieves going ashore just seconds before the first Dutch boat ran aground after them. Now terrified, the townsfolk dropped everything from their stolen nets to their own winter coats in an attempt to run just a little bit faster. But unfortunately for them, some of the townsfolk were slower than others, and several were caught and beaten bloody by the Dutch sailors. After they were done handing out beatings, the Dutchmen calmly walked back to shore where they stole all the coats piled near the criminal's boat before rowing that too back to their ship. The next morning, a small rowboat came alongside, and wouldn't you know it, that same official from before came aboard. And this time he seemed much more subdued, respectful even. Well, hat in hand, the official humbly asked for the small boat and the pile of coats back, explaining that it would be most unchristian to deprive these poor folks of the little possessions they had left. I mean, surely they wouldn't be so hard-hearted as to deprive a man of his coat in such a cold place. Well, if Ney felt any empathy, he really didn't show it, simply sneering at the man, even demanding that everyone who had escaped the night before be brought before him personally for summary judgment.
Do you smoke crack cocaine?
Exactly. Yes, I have smoked crack cocaine.
Well, the Russian official must have then patiently explained why that wasn't only insane, but utterly impractical. I mean, what was he gonna do? Go send an army into the interior to go collect them from the hills? Well, eventually he did talk Ney into giving back the coats and boat, and that's where the matter was settled. Well, on June 29th, the fleet departed, no doubt to the relief of everyone on and around Kielden. And as planned, Ney split the fleet, with the two ships Mercury and Swan under Ney headed south to try for the Voyages Straits, a series of channels between Nova Zembla and the Russian mainland. Once there, Ney and von Linschoten were to scout any and every route through and around Voyages Island, noting any resources or natives they encountered along the way. For if all went well, they would push right through the straits, having plenty of time to map the Russian coast and the Kara Sea beyond. And, who knows, maybe even reach northern China. Meanwhile, Barentsz and the ships from Amsterdam were headed north, tasked by Petrus Plancius with cresting Nova Zembla and pushing as far north as they reasonably could. For if all went well, Barentsz would reach the fabled pack ice, and there he was to find a breach in the legendary ice wall and sail into the semi-tropical polar seas beyond. Admiral Ney and von Linschoten quickly said their goodbyes to Barentsz and the men from Amsterdam with what I imagine was a mix of amusement and pity. For theirs was to be the main thrust of the expedition, each officer knowing full well that everyone's hopes sailed with them and them alone. The trip over what is now Barents Sea was a relatively easy one, but the closer they drew to the Russian mainland, the more dense the ice seemed to become. Well, their progress was soon halted by an epic labyrinth of moving ice. For everywhere they looked, the waters were little more than leads, narrow rivers that would open and close seemingly at random as the ice slowly shifted about. Well, Admiral Ney didn't have time for any of this crap. He simply chose a lead and ordered his ships in. But almost immediately, the ice proved more formidable than he had first thought, as their way forward was soon swallowed up by moving ice. Everyone turned at once, only to watch the way they had come become blocked as well. They were less than a mile in, and already the sliding puzzle that was the pack had trapped them. Their ships were now bobbing in a small patch of blue surrounded by moving ice. Well, in order to cut a new lead, men hopped out onto the ice itself, hacking at it with picks and axes. And after hours of back-breaking toil amongst the ice and sea spray, the crews actually managed to do it. They hacked an escape route. But despite their escape, days of nerve-shattering ice sailing followed, as the seas around them slowly began to fill with more and more loose hunks of ice, some the size of beach balls, while others were the size of entire islands, each threatening to drive them into the pack ice they had just escaped. After a few days of this sort of thing, though, everyone's nerves were shot. And so it was with the utmost relief that scouts reported a well-protected natural harbor somewhere on the Russian coast. Now, the trip had been rough enough already, and each ship had by now sustained multiple impacts with small and large pieces of ice. And thus, they were all grateful for the time to refit and make minor repairs. Not far from their makeshift harbor, scouts spotted some Russian vessels simply waiting at anchor. Quickly, they went aboard, and these sailors told the scouts that the waters around Voyages and Nova Zembla would be ice-free soon, but only remain so for a short time. But the Russians then warned the Dutchmen against such a passage, explaining that just last year an entire Muscovite fleet had become icebound in those same straits. They went on to imply that each ship was crushed by the moving ice, and that their crews had been forced to walk to the mainland where they survived on moss and rats until rescue came that spring. A few days later, the two crews were still hard at work repairing their vessels when a crewmate spotted a pod of whales entering the mouth of their makeshift harbor. Well, the crews began to cheer, most dropping their tools and immediately grabbing weapons. After all, these creatures and their valuable tissues and oils were the only reason anyone bothered to sail these waters in the first place. And moreover, if they could snag even one, the haul might be enough to net each man a small bonus. And better than that, they could eventually sell this location to future whalers. Hell, this place could become the start of an entirely new industry for the Dutch. Well, Admiral Ney too was grateful for a distraction and joined the hunt with gusto, ordering both of his large ships to be placed near the harbor mouth where they could discourage escape by any and every means at their disposal. Meanwhile, some of the more daring men packed into dinghies and whaleboats and went in close to harass and pester the creatures with small arms and pointy sticks. And the men in these small boats somehow managed to corral one of the whales, pushing her closer and closer towards some rocky shallows. And once she had become beached on the jagged rocks, the Dutchmen went in for the kill, doing everything in their power to keep her from the safety of the open water. And the men found it excellent sport, for they were now giant slayers, a story they would tell over and over again at the bars back home. Everyone was having just such a great time. Meanwhile, the terrified and confused creature simply tried its best to escape the constant pain, really succeeding only in trapping itself further, hard and unyielding rocks piercing her flesh in 1,000 places. And the creature was now stuck, its huge frame flailing helplessly in an ill-fated attempt at self-preservation, the shallows first running a pale pink, then a vivid crimson. The next stage of this amounted to a brutal mess, with the Passion Play seeing dozens of men stabbing and shooting at the confused animal. And this lasted for over an hour. Well, after the slaughter, everyone was just a bit exhausted, but knew their work wasn't yet through. For after that, the beach became a vision of hell itself, seeing huge chunks of flesh and fat being flayed from the creature, the pieces being thrown into giant steaming cauldrons to be rendered into lamp oil, the smell horrendous and the filth inescapable. But hey, at least they would all get their small bonus, and after all, isn't that what's really important here? And better than that, they now had tangible proof that such valuable animals were around. And soon more ships would come, and these waters would never be the same again. Well, a few days after that, they set out, only to encounter a native man walking along the Russian coast only a few miles from harbor.
What do you smell? Man flesh.
Well, Ney immediately gave the order, and men were dispatched to collect the native for questioning. And once on shore, the Dutchman tried to coax him over for a chat, but the man was having none of it. Well, frustrated with his behavior, the group finally bum-rushed him, each trying to rope the man like a prized calf. But unlucky for them, it wasn't to be, for the native man was far too strong and wily to be restrained, quickly throwing hands like a world champion before breaking free and running for the literal hills.
I just tried to break his arm, and he got out and laughed at me like, hey, I was like, oh my God.
And for the rest of that man's life, he would most likely tell everyone who would listen the time that he'd almost got abducted by aliens. It was tough going for the next few days, as winds and ice did their best to crush the small Dutch fleet. Once the weather had cleared a bit, the fleet soon encountered a strange island near the shore of Voyages. Upon closer inspection, the island seemed to be littered with pagan items and totems of the stacked head variety. And going ashore soon made it clear that the item was some kind of shrine to fallen natives, as each totem was carved to be a unique likeness, all depicting folks of various ages. Now some of these were freshly carved, while others were cracked and weathered by years of neglect. Now von Linschoten took note. He might be back should he decide these native totems were worth his time, but they thought it best not to dawdle, for by this point in the voyage, another of the North's irritants began to rear their heads by the tens of millions. Now the biting flies had been a problem for a while now, but the closer they came to Nova Zembla and Voyages, the thicker they seemed to become. For this was the height of polar summer, and each fly knew that their time was short, that they had to get as much blood as they could before the snows came, and this fact made them bold. Legend has it among the natives of northern Canada that swarms of these biting flies could drain a grown caribou of all its fluids, mummifying it in mere minutes.
Yeah, so the black flies are pretty bad on this May 2-4 weekend.
And in order to escape the trillion little bloodsuckers, the crew took to spending most of their time below decks, smoking the place out with their coal stove just to be rid of them. To mixed success. The fleet soon moved on, but with every mile, the ice seemed to grow thicker and thicker, and soon Ney was forced to order his ships into yet another harbor to wait out yet another storm. Only this time their harbor mouth quickly became clogged with icebergs. They were trapped. And so for days they sat icebound with little but the flow of ice past their harbor mouth to keep their attention. One particular berg was larger than any of them had ever seen before, and for a while it looked as though it would grind right into their harbor, smashing their ships like toys. But lucky for them, it continued on its way. Well, after spending a day bracing for an impact that never came, the men went ashore to clear their heads. And not far in, they spotted a few guys on sleds being pulled by reindeer. And because they hadn't learned a damn thing, the Dutchman ran up on the closest man with ropes and weapons in hand, calling in Russian for him to stop. Well, as his attackers came on, the netted man let out a cry to the heavens that gave the Dutchman pause. What the hell was that, they wondered? But the what the hell of it soon became clear, as the surrounding hills soon became littered with more and more men on sleds. First a few, and then more than a dozen. And then the missiles began to soar in, landing with disconcerting accuracy, each arrow seeming to miss them on purpose. Well, all at once, the Dutchmen who had thought themselves in the ascendant began to run for their lives as arrows and curses landed all around them. And again they slunk back to the ships, feeling just a tad stupid.
Are we the baddies?
There would be no more shore parties for a while. Well, days later, the harbor ice finally broke and they pushed on. And not long after, the two ships finally reached their objective, the straits separating Nova Zembla and the Russian mainland, a place they called the Straits of Nassau. But unfortunately, as they approached, the currents and winds shifted, blowing huge chunks of ice into the straits. And before their very eyes, this golden gate slammed shut, and soon the entire span was clogged with sea ice. Well, the men simply couldn't believe it. An hour ago, the straits were clear as day and ready to be sailed. And now? Well, now the clog was beginning to spread as more and more ice began to pile in. Before long, the very seas around them also began to fill with ice, and the order was soon given to turn away. Well, at the sight of yet more ice, the men's morale began to fall precipitately. In fact, morale was so low that the Dutchmen actually behaved themselves when more natives were spotted down the coast of Voyages not long after. And this time, they sent an unarmed Russian interpreter bearing gifts. You know, what they probably should have done in the first place. And after a short standoff, the natives saw this display of friendship and duly reciprocated. Well, absolutely stoked at receiving gifts from these strangers, the native Nenets began to call over more and more of their number from the hills. And before long, the natives and the Dutch had a little block party going right there on the ice. Well, the Dutchmen produced more gifts they called trifles, trinkets, cloth, food, etc. And between mouthfuls of cheese and ale, the natives explained that the southern straits would be clear soon, and that the Kara Sea beyond was ice-free year-round. Well, true or not, it was exactly what the Dutchmen wanted to hear. The party seemed to be a hit, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. That is, unless we count von Linschoten, who just absolutely hated these people. The dude goes on and on in his journals about how the Nenets were deformed monsters, untamable, dirty, and thieves to a man. But most of all, he hated their beardless faces. The enlightened adventurer calling them monkeys. Now how having no hair on one's face qualifies them as simian is beyond my feeble understanding, but not apparently von Linschoten's.
Do you smoke crack cocaine?
Exactly.
But regardless of some people, it was with a new spring in their step that men put out from their harbor, their heads filled with good impressions and cool stories to peddle back home. And lucky for them, this time when they tried, the straits were just ice-free enough to allow them through. It had taken far longer than first hoped, but they had now completed the first part of their mission. Now the real exploration could begin. Well, somewhere on the other side of Voyages, the men saw a group of walrus for the first time. What von Linschoten called a sea elephant. And wouldn't you know it, they immediately piled into boats bent on killing and skinning the poor creatures. After all, they could use its corpse as proof of the excellent hunting up here. And as with the whale, maybe even start an entirely new industry back home. The men immediately pulled close enough to engage with hand weapons, and what followed amounted to just a bunch of nonsense. Failing to close with even one of the sea elephants, the Dutchmen angrily began to open fire with their arquebuses, a shot eventually wounding one of the animals in its side. But the mighty sea creature seemed to have just shrugged it off like a skinned knee before attempting to swim off. Well, now severely annoyed, the men followed the trail of oily blood left in its wake, shooting and cursing at the obstinate sea beast the entire time. But eventually the wounds did take their toll, and the mighty creature began to slow, its breathing becoming heavier and heavier with each stroke. Now seeing their chance, the would-be hunters pulled closer and tried to attack the sea elephant with pole arms and hand axes. And the men struck out with all their might, thrashing at the exhausted walrus with countless axe blows and spear thrusts. They were doing it. They were winning. Only that's not what happened at all. Yeah, as it turns out, walrus hides are tough as hell, an entire armor class above anything these Dutchmen were prepared for. And they soon noticed that as they thrashed the creature, axe heads and spear points were exploding, sending shards of metal out in every direction. Their weapons were useless. Be it bad metallurgy, the cold, or the armored hides themselves, no hand weapon could do much to the sea elephants. But regardless of the why, the Dutchmen just kept breaking their weapons, and to make matters even worse, at least for them, it didn't look like they'd done much damage at all. If anything, the things seemed to be gaining strength as the adrenaline kicked in. And it was true. The would-be walrus hunters looked over only to see the sea elephant beginning to hulk out, eyes bulging as its heart rate increased. Well, after the literal sea monster was done hulking out, it lunged for their yacht, crashing against the timbers with a splintering thud over and over again. Wood began to buckle and crack as the 2-ton sea monster raked its valuable tusks against their boat, and a panic ensued as the tiny craft then began to pitch and roll wildly under the brutal assault. And about that time, they all had the same thought. We gotta get the hell out of here. As none of them particularly wanted a bath in Arctic waters infested with monsters, and they quickly disengaged as fast as they could, rowing like their lives depended on it because they probably did. Well, after that, the two ships spotted a small speck of land they called States Island, after the States General back home. Going ashore, they found the beaches littered with shiny sand-polished crystals, and more importantly, a source of fresh water not far from shore. And for a while after, they pushed east, simply hugging the north coast of Russia and looking for any break in the ice that would allow them passage further east. But such a passage never came into view. But what did come into their view were mirages. Apparitions of various kinds, from tall ships to men on shore, plagued them, the mists and haze of this region constantly playing tricks on the men's minds. And I'm serious, this place gave everyone the creeps, men and officers alike. Nothing but angry ice, unknown land, and constant mists and fog. It was like sailing through a bad dream. And this fear, coupled with the lateness of the season, began to weigh on the men's minds. And so it was with the utmost relief that scouts reported the coast dropping far away to the south just ahead of them. Well, they looked out into the distance and saw no land on the other side of it. This had to be it then. This was exactly what von Linschoten had been waiting for. The object of all his endeavors. He had finally found the end of the Asian landmass, found the open sea bending south. He was now convinced that following it would lead straight to the fabled North China coast. In fact, he'd probably only encountered the Gulf of Ob and was still more than 2,400 miles from the true way east, the Bering Straits between Alaska and Kamchatka. Well, von Linschoten figured that they could get farther, following the coast south for like a week or two, but why? And besides, it was getting late in the year. No one wanted to get caught up during polar night, frozen into an unknown sea. Ugh. No, best to return home and refit for an even greater voyage, one better equipped for the long haul. And on the way back, von Linschoten just couldn't help himself. He made sure to stop back at the island full of idols so he could steal some to take back and show his friends. He was going to make the most of this, as he did have a career to consider after all. For in the circles he ran in, you were either interesting or you were no one at all. Now it was slow going back around Voyages as the free-floating ice was thicker now, and they knew that each piece could easily pierce the hulls and drown them all. Well, fearing this, they stayed closer to shore, but there they had to contend with all sorts of sandbars and undersea rocks, several of which collided with the two ships on their way out, and sweaty palms were had by all. And after squeezing back through the quickly closing straits, they pushed back north towards Zembla. And not long after, they spotted the topsails and masts of Barentz's own ship. How random. He had only just put into shelter from some storms the day before, and they had found him by sheer dumb luck. A few weeks before. Barentsz said his goodbyes to Ney and the other two ships and began sailing north, no doubt relieved to be free of Ney and von Linschoten. And though he never could have known it, Barentsz was now sailing on a massive sea that would one day bear his name. And a choppy voyage of 6 days soon saw his ships through to the object of their quest, Nova Zembla. Well, the place immediately gave everyone the creeps. It was a dead place as far as they were concerned, rocky and barren with barely a shrub to add color. It was a place of drab brown streaked with gray and black rocks, a lot of it covered by blankets of dirty half-melted snow and the tracks of countless unknown creatures, the odd patch of green grass fighting here and there for its place in the sun. The men felt strange here, uneasy as if stepping onto the surface of another planet, and for good reason. They were now walking on shores unseen by all but a few southerners. The unfriendly seas at their back, their only familiar and constant. Even after going ashore to scout for birds and fresh water, no one was really all that impressed. Nova Zembla really was the end of the world as far as they were concerned, and every man aboard was eager to begin their task, if nothing else than to escape this liminal space all the quicker. As his ships glided up the western coast of Nova Zembla, Barentsz meticulously mapped every curve and contour of this new land, as he still wasn't sure if Nova Zembla was a single landmass or an archipelago, but was hell-bent on finding out one way or another. Farther on, at a place they called Lamsbay, Barentz's men found an intact ship's mast laying like driftwood along the shore. They took the time to stop and stand it upright like an obelisk, creating an artificial landmark, each man trying their best not to think about how it had gotten there in the first place. And on they went in much the same way, mapping and going ashore to look for anything of note, stacking stones here and marking any natural features they saw there. The seas farther on soon became obscured by a dense pea soup fog, and their ship was forced into a nearby bay to shelter. And as if to add to the surreal nature of the landscape, some kind of crazy-looking white bear was spotted through the mists. Without much hesitation, groups of men piled into boats equipped with nooses and ropes, ready to snare the animal. Yeah, these guys sincerely thought they could just capture a grown-ass polar bear and just store it on the ship like some kind of pet. Ugh. The men paddled hard, trying their best to catch up to the beast, but what they failed to realize was that a bear in the water is quite a bit faster than a group of little men in a rowboat. Well, frustration eventually got the better of them, and they just started shooting. After several shots went wide, they actually managed to wound the creature. Taking advantage of the situation, some dedicated soul then managed to get close enough to throw a lasso around the bear's neck. He then quickly tied off the line and settled in for a fight like he was fishing for marlin or something. Now, I think they were just kind of hoping that the thing would continue to pull them along until it got tired, but much to their frustration, the bear just wouldn't cooperate. I mean, why pull a heavy boat full of yelling monkeys when she could simply chase them off and hop onto the nice dry boat herself? Now desperate to keep her off, the men went to the edges of their whaleboat and began to beat at the animal with halberds, oars, and clubs, just anything to keep her from boarding the tiny craft. However, their feeble blows landed with little effect, adrenaline and fear having rendered the animal all but immune to their attacks. She simply brushed them off before wrapping her giant forepaws around the side of their boat. Barentsz, who happened to be aboard the small boat, tried to reassure the men, telling them that she will there rest herself, assuming that the bear was too exhausted to be much of a threat. However, she was not nearly as tired as anyone thought she was, as all it took was a few gulps of air to re-energize the creature. The men then recoiled in absolute horror as the literal sea monster began to claw its way onto their tiny whaleboat, the craft pitching wildly from side to side as the 800-pound animal flopped aboard. And well, after they got done pissing themselves, the humans fled to one side of the boat, waving their useless weapons and shouting like teens at a pop concert. But they needn't have worried, as just as their mighty antagonist was about to pull her entire bulk onto their boat, she stopped and began to choke and rattle loudly. As it turned out, the rope around the creature's neck had somehow become tangled around the rudder of their tiny craft. And try as she might, her struggles only made the knot squeeze tighter and tighter. The poor creature now found herself in a Chinese finger trap situation, half on the boat and half off, choking and desperate for any relief. The vicious ropes cutting deeper and deeper the harder she strained against them. Now, seeing the beast's situation for what it was, one crewmate grew bold and stabbed her with a large pike, the wound opening up her guts like a sleeping bag, as warm blood and organs spilled out onto the deck, filling the cold northern air with a horrid steam. Well, despite being mortally wounded, she flung herself into the water and began dragging the boat and her organs behind her in a desperate attempt to escape. But, finally, inevitably, she slowed and soon gave up the fight, her body limp and exsanguinated. Well, seeing this, the crews found their courage and closed, brutally stabbing and thrashing at the creature until she succumbed under 1,000 cuts and insults. The waters around now streaked with bands of blood and oil. Well, everyone then had a good laugh as they skinned her, naming the place Port Bear in her honor, and good times were had by all, except the bear. But pointless animal murder aside, farther up the coast they spied some cliffs in the distance upon which sat 2 crosses. A memorial or a warning? Either way, it kind of messed with everyone's heads to see yet another memorial this far north. But creeped out as they were, they simply named the place Cross Island and set out once more. Once back at sea, though, a massive storm soon blew up, and brutal winds began to rake the ship as waves began to grow taller and ever more frequent. Earlier that day, Barentsz had ordered the yacht's crew to come aboard the main ship for the duration of the weather. And it was seriously lucky that he did, for at some point during the tempest, their small yacht was torn free and smashed to bits in the churning seas. One second it was there, and then next it just wasn't. Poof, swallowed up. But despite the loss of their yacht, Barentsz and his men were still optimistic. Yeah, now they couldn't map the coast in the detail they would have liked, their large shipping unable to get into all those tight spaces, but at least they were all still alive. Well, pressing on, the ice was thicker this far north, free pieces floating here and there, some colliding with shore ice, and others bouncing from obstacle to obstacle like pinballs. But despite the fast-moving ice and increasingly bad weather, Barentsz and his crews managed to round the tip of Nova Zembla on July 29, 1594, becoming possibly the first Europeans to ever do so. Yeah, as it turned out, her coast did end somewhere after all, and closer than anyone would have ever thought. But there was still one thing nagging at the men's minds. What were these open polar seas? As evidently they still lay way to the north of Nova Zembla. For as they cast their eyes north, all they saw was vast sheets of ice stretching on to infinity. Unless they all sprouted wings, they wouldn't be going that way. They named the northern tip of Nova Zembla after the one feature it had in abundance, calling the place Ice Point. Now while there, the crews went ashore to do a little discovering of their own. And not long after, one guy comes running back with a sparkly rock, yelling about gold in them there hills. And like COVID at a MAGA rally, a gold fever soon broke out, infecting most of the crew in short order. As with the smell of profits in the air, most men abandoned their posts, rushing ashore to scoop up all the shiny rocks they could fit in their pockets. And to Barentsz and his officers, a gold strike probably would have been about the best news they ever could have hoped for, but even so, they weren't so sure about these rocks flecked with yellow glimmers. So quickly they ordered some samples brought to them, and unfortunately for all involved, the officers quickly found the gold-like substance to be nothing more than iron pyrites, so-called fool's gold. I speculate a bit. The officers may have sat the men down and told them the story of the English under Martin Frobisher, how he had attempted a large-scale gold mining operation near Greenland and how things had gone poorly. The ostensibly gold-bearing rocks that he had brought home, worthless. The entire haul eventually broken down and used as road gravel. Well, pressing on, the ice began to fill the waters to their south, and in order to get around this, Barentsz set a course northeast toward a gap in the ice, soon running into a few small islands he graciously named Orange, after Maurits, stadtholder of the Netherlands and an official business daddy to the Dutch people. And while making their way around these islands, the crew spotted some crazy-looking seahorses, only they had flippers and giant teeth and looked nothing like horses. Wait, what? Yeah, as it turned out, the crew had stumbled upon a beach full of sunbathing walrus, none of whom were particularly happy to see them. For you see, these walrus saw the humans for what they were, dangerous predators, and the females began to usher their young into the sea just as some of the males began to form up a kind of battle line to block the humans. Well, this display of intelligence and organization was lost on all but a few of the Dutchmen, as the crew's attention was drawn to more capitalistic concerns, as all they saw were long spears of valuable ivory just jutting from these lazy beasts' mouths. Hell, screw the fool's gold, they just found the ivory motherlode, for all intents and purposes, just as, if not more valuable. Now almost frothing with greed, men grabbed any weapons they had at hand and quickly went ashore to do battle with the seahorses. And these guys would soon learn the same lesson that the southern party had. And yeah, as it turned out, it ended much the same as it had with them, as a walrus can get as heavy as 2 tons and, as we've seen, have armor plus 10. So these rickety little sailors and their feeble little pointy sticks had very little chance. Oh yeah, that's where the term rickety comes from, by the way. You know, malnourished children that grew into bow-legged and unsteady adults. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, back to the violence. The crew struck out with their weapons only to see pole arms break and metal shatter and deform against their quarry's hide. And the line of males seemed to have held strong against the angry monkeys, and soon all the females and their calves had made it to open water and safety. Now seeing this, the mighty bewhiskered beasts began to pull away from the humans, each hoping to now rejoin the herd. And as the walrus began to disengage, a few of the men grew concerned. How are they going to get that ivory now? Well, the walruses began to ignore their attackers, shuffling and scooting their bulky frames down the black beaches toward the sea. And soon the crew was all that was left on the beach. They hadn't even managed to kill a single one of the seahorses. But there was good news, at least as far as the Dutchmen were concerned. For during the scramble, a few of the more psychotic sailors had somehow managed to break off a good many tusks. Like a lot of them. I'll leave the logistics behind that one to your imagination, but at least they would still get paid, so yay? Well, still unsatisfied with their take, the crews hopped into their whaleboat, reasoning that if the weapons they had ashore weren't enough to kill the seahorses, then the heavy swivel guns aboard the ship might do the trick. Those things could put a 3-inch hole through just about anything. Well, on their way back to get bigger guns, they spotted a bear just minding its own business on shore. And because reasons, they just began to shoot at that with one of the harquebuses they had at hand. Yeah, and this time their aim was on point. With only a few shots, they managed to severely wound the poor creature. Yay? They then had little trouble catching up to the brutally injured animal and unfortunately vented the day's frustration on it until it expired. And then, for whatever reason, they decided to get creepy with this one and pose the dead bear up using a pike to make it stand upright. Oh, how fun. Yeah, I'm guessing they either wanted to freak their buddies out, or they hoped it would just kind of freeze solid, like some kind of weird meat statue. I sincerely don't know. All I know for sure is that they posed the thing like they were hunters in a trophy room, and all had a good laugh about it. But unfortunately for them and their creepy little plans, a storm soon blew in. And as the winds began to pick up, Barentsz was forced to sound the trumpets from the ship. And the shore party knew well what that meant. The ship had to move lest it be crushed between the ice and the rocks. And so the signal now given, the men ashore raced back to the ship, no one wanting to get left behind, no telling if the ship could or even would return for them. They tried traveling south for a few days, but soon encountered more sea ice than any of them had ever seen before. It was simply all-encompassing, and even 100 miles out, there was no way through. Trust me, they tried. It seems that Barentsz and his crew had sailed into a massive crescent of dense ice, the arch stretching from the coast far out into the Kara Sea, and where it stopped, who on earth knew? But what they did know is that they'd never reach it. And days of this kind of thing finally broke the crew, and everyone was starting to get just a little freaked out. I mean, for days and days they'd been sailing parallel to an infinite plane of jagged ice. I mean, what was to stop that thing from just coming in and crushing them? There'd be nothing they could do. Seriously, as far as any of them were concerned, this was just about the worst place in the world, like sailing into purgatory itself. And so the crew soon made their case to Barentsz, explaining that they had gone farther than any known ship into waters never before mapped. They had rounded the semi-mythic Nova Zembla and moved down her eastern coast, and they had at the very least shown that Nova Zembla did indeed end, and that it could be crested using traditional means, and, for what it's worth, proved that the warm seas still lay far to the north. I mean, this was enough for them. The last thing they wanted was to stick around only to be frozen in. Every man aboard feared a winter shrouded by eternal night in this godforsaken place. I mean, who knew what manner of goblins and monsters called the treeless interior of this island home? Ugh. Well, Barentsz looked south and sighed. He would do as his crew asked. He could see the ice plain as they, and knew well that the plains preventing them from going east could easily begin moving, trapping his tiny ship between the pack and the land and possibly crushing them all to bits. And so he relented. Well, the way back was surprisingly easy and damn quick, with the winds at their back the entire time. Well, after only about a week, they found themselves near the southern coast at a place they called Mealhaven, being named so for a few bags of grain they had found buried in a cache near shore. This cache was near a small ghost town constructed in a Russian style, but in an advanced state of decay. A few skeletons were even found in unburied coffins near one of the buildings, and generally the place gave everyone the creeps. De Vere. There lay a long black rock close by the land, whereon there stood a cross. There they went on land with their boat and perceived that some men had been there, and that they had fled to save themselves. For there they found 6 sacks with rye meal buried in the ground, and a heap of stones by the cross, and a bullet for a great piece. And thereabouts stood another cross with 3 houses made of wood after a north country manner. And in the houses they found many wooden battle staves that they conjectured were used to take up salmons, and by them stood 5 or 6 coffins by graves with dead men's bones, the coffins standing upright in the ground, all filled with stones. There also lay a broken Russian ship, the keel thereof being 44 foot long, but they could see no man on the land. It is a fair haven for all winds, which they called Mealhaven, because of the meal they had found there. Rambled Garrett de Vere like an escaped mental patient at a bus stop. Jesus, man. Talk about run-on sentences. Well, no man wanted to stick around there, and they quickly moved on. More questions than answers rattling around in their heads. All they knew was they didn't like it here. Well, not long after, they put into a bay to avoid some ice and weather, taking pains to tack around the many shallows that littered the approaches. The next day, men from the mast called out, "Ships!" with a mix of joy and apprehension. And as the 2 shapes came on, it soon became clear that Ney was headed right for the shallows, oblivious to the ebbing tides. Well, Barentsz and his men had a mini panic attack as the 2 ships glided over the shallows with mere inches to spare. The newcomers probably looking out at their compatriots wearing concerned expressions and were like, "What?" If they had grounded, or God forbid, been dashed on the rocks, the day would have been much different. Like, dude, next time look. Reunited, the 2 groups exchanged information and charts. Barentsz explaining that he had not in fact circumnavigated Nova Zembla, but he had at least shown another route into the Kara Sea. And this was a big deal, as Ney and von Linschoten's party had proved that the Kara Sea was always navigable and never ice-logged. All one had to do once they entered her waters was sail along the coast, following that all the way to northern China. Well, on their way back, they stopped at a small island where they murdered all sorts of birds as well as taking their eggs. You know, an ecological disaster. And along with the seabird massacre of '94, they managed to net themselves 2 live falcons at some point. Well, those things were worth pretty good money back home, and discoveries or no, these guys were always down to make a buck wherever and whenever they could. Weeks later, they put into the Scandinavian port of Varthaus for repairs, only to be accosted by a Danish customs officer. Well, the man was full of questions and just a bit of a jerk at first, demanding a bribe. Well, the dude starts to puff up his chest and make all sorts of demands and veiled threats. He asked them who they were and how far they'd gone, and for copies of any maps they'd made along the way. Well, Ney simply scoffed at this upstart bureaucrat. He would get no information out of them. But the man was nothing if not persistent, so he sighed a bit before handing over a small bribe in the form of a few heavy Spanish coins. He knew well what men like this were really after. And wouldn't you know it, the guy gave them absolutely no more trouble after that, and even, dare I say, turned friendly. Well, Ney and the officers must have smiled a bit. This Dane had just traded news of a way to cafe, all for a few paltry coins. Neither he nor anyone else would learn of the Straits of Nassau, for that Golden Gate was now a closely guarded national secret, first step on their way to a new northern empire. On the next episode of Barentsz at Sea, the 3 ships return as heroes, wined and dined by elite society, some enjoying themselves more than others. Quickly, a new expedition is planned and funded, their small fleet of outdated ships replaced by a proper trade flotilla backed by the full might of the Dutch Republic. But until then, this has been Storytime with Mr. Jackson, and I've been your host, Andrew Jackson, wishing you safe travels and dry socks. If you like what you heard, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every little bit helps. Thank you.